Let's get straight into it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like a scene from some ridiculous reality show. My best friend, no, my childhood best friend, was sitting across from me with this intense, fixed look on her face like I was an unruly child she had to get under control. And the demand she had just made, it hit me like a bucket of ice water. She wanted me to get rid of my scars. It was supposed to be a casual lunch to talk about wedding plans. I had been looking forward to it, thinking we'd talk color schemes and flower arrangements. Instead, she'd spent the first 20 minutes talking about the beauty treatments and cosmetic procedures she'd gotten in the lead up to the wedding. Her idea of wedding prep had turned into some kind of extreme makeover. I had no problem with that if it made her happy, but this next part, not so much. I had scars from a car accident a few years back, scars that I'd come to terms with in my own time. They weren't hideous or anything, they were just part of me now. But she seemed to have decided that they were a problem. Her words rang in my ears. She'd said I could only stand next to her in the wedding photos if I agreed to fix my scars. Otherwise, they'd ruin her aesthetic vision for the big day. At first, I thought she was joking. I actually laughed a little and waited for her to say she was messing with me. But her expression didn't change. Her eyes were still locked on me, dead serious. I let her know right away that wasn't happening. I said that these scars were a part of me, and no one, not even my best friend, could dictate how I should look, especially for something like her wedding. I also reminded her that I'd supported her unconditionally all these years, through every high and low, and I didn't expect this kind of judgment from her. She had the audacity to look surprised, even hurt. She said that she was only asking because she wanted her wedding to be perfect and that it wasn't personal. She then suggested that my brother could pay for the procedure if money was an issue. I felt my stomach churn. I knew she was obsessed with her looks, but this? It was a whole new level. I told her that if my scars were such a big problem, then maybe I wasn't meant to be her maid of honor. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, and I could see her growing frustration as she realized I wasn't budging. Finally, she just gave a small, tight smile and said that I should think about it, then got up and walked out. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. The next person I told was my brother. I figured he deserved to know, given she'd suggested he pay for some unnecessary procedure to fix me. I'll never forget his reaction. He was as horrified as I was, probably more. He said he'd had no idea that his fiancée had made that kind of request and apologized on her behalf, though I could tell it was eating at him. Days went by without a word from her, and I couldn't get the whole thing out of my mind. We'd been friends since we were little kids, inseparable through school and all the way to adulthood. I'd been genuinely happy for her when she and my brother got together, but now all those memories were clouded by this superficial judgment attitude she'd shown me. And it wasn't just the scars. Everything about her had changed over the last 5 years or so. She'd gone from being someone down to earth to this over-the-top, image-obsessed person. From what I could gather, her entire life was now about how things looked, about maintaining this flawless social media reality. I couldn't recognize her anymore. The person I once knew would never have said something like that. It didn't stop there, though. Word of her demand somehow made it to a few people in our circles. Rumors started to spread, and soon enough, everyone knew about it. To my surprise, there was quite a bit of backlash. People couldn't believe she'd make such a ridiculous request, especially of her best friend. My brother, meanwhile, grew more and more distant from her. He'd been supportive of her initial wedding plans, but found himself increasingly frustrated as her demands piled up. Many of them centered on image, perfection, and control. I could tell he was questioning whether he wanted to spend his life with someone who seemed to care more about appearances than the people around her. My family, too, were caught in the crossfire of her demands. My mom, who had always thought of her as a daughter, was growing wary of her. I could see the distance forming, small but there. Still, I hadn't made any moves to cut ties completely. Part of me hoped that maybe she'd wake up and realize the harm she was causing. We had years of history. I didn't want to believe that all of it had come to this. Then finally, she reached out again. I could sense the tension even in her text message. This forced pleasantness that barely concealed her exasperation. She asked if I had reconsidered, as if her perfect vision should override my comfort and personal boundaries. The nerve of it nearly left me speechless. I wrote back that I hadn't changed my mind, and she didn't respond after that. I thought about her request again as I stared at myself in the mirror that night. I ran my fingers over the faint scars on my arm and shoulder, remembering how long it took me to accept them. They were reminders of something painful, yes, but also of my strength. I'd come to terms with them, and no amount of shallow judgment could change that. This whole experience was quickly becoming an eye-opener. I knew I couldn't let her or anyone else dictate what I should look like to fit into their picture of perfection. And seeing my brother growing increasingly distant from her was, if anything, a relief. I hoped he'd see through her demands and remember that real relationships, family, love, and friendship weren't about appearances. It was ironic, really. The person who used to stand by me in my worst moments was now trying to make me erase those very memories from my body, all for the sake of a picture-perfect fantasy. I didn't know what was going to happen with the wedding plans, but one thing was clear to me. I wasn't going to compromise myself for anyone, not even her. Update 1. Around 20 days had passed and everything was slowly, painfully unraveling. The demand for me to fix my scars was still a sore spot, and every time I thought about it, my anger flared again. I'd been holding steady, refusing to back down, but things had only escalated since then. I thought that after some time, things might settle down, but they didn't. If anything, the situation had only worsened. It started with my brother. At first, he'd been adamant that he didn't support his fiancée's request. He'd been apologetic and told me that she had overstepped, but I could tell he was growing more distant from her, and it was not just about what she asked of me. The more time passed, the more I noticed the rift in his relationship with her. He had always been the kind of guy who tried to avoid confrontation, but I could see that he was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to how much she had changed. I didn't have to be a genius to realize that his fiancée's obsession with appearances was starting to get to him. She had been so focused on her wedding vision, on her perfect look, the perfect dress, the perfect everything, that she started to alienate everyone around her. We talked on the phone a few times over the last couple of weeks, and I could tell he was walking on eggshells. He'd mentioned how she was becoming more demanding, more difficult to deal with, but he kept trying to avoid outright criticism. He loved her, or at least he had. I could see it in his voice when he talked about her. Even though his words were getting colder with every conversation, he said he was trying to work things out with her, but there was an edge in his tone that told me he was losing patience. Then there was her, the bride-to-be. She was almost completely consumed by the upcoming wedding, which I had initially thought was normal. After all, weddings are supposed to be dramatic, right? But this obsession The way she'd put herself at the center of everything had begun to feel toxic. It wasn't just about wanting a beautiful day. It was about control, about making everything about her. She'd undergone an extensive list of cosmetic procedures in the weeks following our lunch, from lip fillers to Botox, all in the name of being perfect for the wedding. Her once natural beauty had been replaced by something artificial, and it felt like she was trying to be someone else, someone she wasn't. I couldn't help but think that all these procedures were her way of dealing with insecurity, but they also made her demands all the more ridiculous. She didn't just want me to get rid of my scars anymore, she was pushing her image-driven agenda into everyone. She was trying to grow her bridal party into a group of perfectly groomed women, all who conformed to her standard of beauty, and I could tell she was trying to fit me into that mold too, even if it meant me getting surgery. It wasn't just about the scars anymore, it was everything. She started making these offhand comments about how I should dress better or fix my hair, things that had never bothered her before. I felt like I was no longer seen as the friend who had been with her through thick and thin, but as some kind of accessory, an asset to be improved to match her new vision. Then, about a week ago, things took a sharp turn. My brother called me late one evening, his voice hoarse, like he'd been holding something back for too long. He said that he couldn't keep going with the wedding plans. He said it was over. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Was he calling off the wedding? Had he changed his mind? He hesitated, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Then he dropped the bombshell. He'd broken up with her. After a fight that had spiraled completely out of control, he had told her he couldn't marry her. He said that her obsession with perfection had driven a wedge between them, and he just couldn't live like that. He told me that he felt suffocated by her constant need to control everything, from her appearance to every aspect of their relationship. The fight had escalated quickly, and she had tried to guilt him into staying with her by reminding him of the wedding, but it was too late. He couldn't take it anymore. I was floored. The whole situation was a mess, but deep down, part of me felt a sense of relief. I knew she wasn't the right fit for him anymore. All the superficiality, the obsession with status and control, none of it was healthy. And he deserved someone who cared about more than just a perfectly curated life. But the fact that it had gotten this far, that he'd had to call off the wedding, was a huge wake-up call for everyone involved. For a few days, I didn't hear from either of them. My brother was silent, and I knew he needed time. She, on the other hand, was posting incessantly on social media, showing off her new look. Now that her procedures had settled in, she posted pictures of herself looking more artificial than ever, with captions about empowering herself and living her best life. I could tell she was trying to cover up the fact that her world was crumbling around her. She'd gone so far down this path of needing external validation that she couldn't bear to show any vulnerability. Then, almost as soon as the dust settled, I got a message from her. She was apologizing. I hadn't expected it. Not after everything that had happened. Her message was long, filled with all the right words about how she had been selfish and wrong, about how she understood now that she had hurt me. She said she wanted to fix things, not just with me, but with my brother too. She was still hoping for some miracle that could save her relationship. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I spent the next couple of days mulling over it. I was angry, hurt, and above all, exhausted. I didn't want to get involved in the fallout of their breakup. I knew it wasn't my place, but I couldn't help feeling a little smug knowing that maybe she had finally learned her lesson. I thought about how her world had collapsed because she tried to force everything into this perfect unrealistic vision. She had manipulated my brother into this situation, and now she was trying to clean it up. I didn't want to get sucked back into her bubble of superficiality, her endless cycle of demands. I had already seen what she was willing to sacrifice for the sake of a perfect life, and it wasn't worth it. I knew my brother would come around, but as for her, I wasn't so sure, not anymore. As I looked at her message again, the same thought kept repeating in my head. She had snapped out of her bubble, but she had already destroyed so much in the process. I wasn't about to rush to her aid, not after everything she'd done. Update 2. Another 10 days had passed since my brother had called off the wedding, and things hadn't exactly settled down. I thought there might be some kind of resolution, but instead, everything seemed to be in a state of constant flux. My brother had stayed largely out of contact with me, and the silence from him felt deafening. I could only guess what was going on in his head, but if I were to be honest, I did feel really bad for him. He had made his choice. Even if it meant enduring a difficult fallout, I could only imagine the whirlwind he'd been caught up in. Then one afternoon, as I was going through some work emails, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something about it caught my attention. I had no intention of answering at first, but the call seemed urgent, almost desperate. I let it ring a few more times before finally picking it up. It was my ex-to-be sister-in-law's mother. I had expected the call to be from her, or maybe even from my brother himself, but not from her mom. After everything that had happened, I couldn't imagine why she'd be reaching out to me. The woman had never been warm towards me, and her daughter had only made things worse in recent months. Still, I answered, unsure of what to expect. She got right to the point. No small talk. She told me that she hadn't been able to reach my brother for days and was starting to worry. I wasn't surprised. He'd been pretty closed off since everything fell apart, and she knew it. But what caught me off guard was her next statement. She asked me if we could meet, the three of us, together. She, me, and my mother. I didn't immediately respond. I let the words sink in, and a slow, almost reluctant thought started forming in my mind. Was this some kind of guilt trip? Was she expecting me to fix things between my brother and her daughter? To act as some kind of mediator in a situation that had nothing to do with me anymore? After a few seconds, I finally told her I'd get back to her. The whole thing felt off. There was no real apology in her voice, just concern. But it seemed almost selfish. She wasn't worried about my brother's well-being as much as she was worried about the fallout from the wedding collapse. I could almost hear her thoughts as she spoke. Her desperation to get everything back on track, to salvage her daughter's image and reputation. After hanging up, I called my mother to let her know what had happened. My mom listened in silence, a deep sigh escaping her lips when I finished recounting the conversation. "Don't get involved," my mom said, her voice steady but firm. "She's just trying to save face." All the time, I was caught off guard by how calm my mother sounded. She hadn't spoken to my ex-to-be sister-in-law or her mother either, but I had assumed she'd been more, emotional about it. Instead, she seemed detached, almost like she was just watching from the sidelines. I had been prepared for a lot of things, but not this. I thought that my mom would be caught up in the drama, maybe even tried to make peace for my brother's sake. Instead, she was giving me the clear green light to keep my distance. I didn't expect to feel such relief. But that relief quickly evaporated when my mother continued speaking. "I spoke with your brother about it," she said, pausing for a moment, probably weighing her words. "He's not ready to talk to her yet, and frankly, I don't think he should. This has gone far enough." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding at that moment. So it wasn't just me who was distancing myself. My mother had turned down the invitation to speak to her as well. I wasn't the only one seeing through the layers of manipulation. I hadn't realized how much my mom had been affected by all of this too. She hadn't said much during the initial fallout, but now I could see she had her own reservations about the whole situation. My ex-to-be sister-in-law's need for control, her obsession with appearances, and the pressure she had placed on my brother had begun to weigh on everyone. It wasn't just a superficial thing. It was a systemic issue that had started to tear through the family's dynamics. But as I processed everything my mother said, something else clicked. If my mother was standing her ground, then maybe I needed to too. I wasn't going to be dragged into this mess. I'd already stood up for myself, and now I needed to let things unfold on their own. Over the next few days, my sister-in-law's mother called me again. This time, she was more persistent. She didn't outright beg, but I could hear the desperation in her voice. She kept telling me how much it would mean to her daughter if we could all just sit down together and talk for the sake of their childhood friendship. I wasn't sure if she truly believed that was the reason, or if it was just a last-ditch effort to try and repair her daughter's relationship with my brother. I knew deep down what she was trying to do. She wanted me to be the bridge, to fix things, to act like everything was normal again, but things weren't normal, and I wasn't going to pretend that they were. Finally, 2 days later, after receiving yet another voicemail from her, I decided I'd take the conversation into my own hands. I wasn't going to let her twist my arm any longer. I sent her a text, short and to the point. I don't think this is something I can fix, and frankly, I don't think it's my place to. My brother needs space, and so do I. Please respect that. I didn't expect a reply, and for the most part, there wasn't one. Update 3. I received another message, and this time it wasn't just a simple apology or an attempt to clarify her past actions. The message was long and carefully worded, and to be honest, it felt a bit rehearsed. The bride-to-be wasn't just acknowledging that she had been wrong. She was asking me to give her another chance, and she was trying to manipulate me into feeling guilty for not being the person she needed me to be. Her words were almost sweet. Too sweet. She apologized for how she had treated me, but it didn't sound like the heartfelt admission I'd been hoping for. No, this was more of an attempt to sway me, to pull on my emotions, and it reeked of someone who knew they had messed up and now had to clean up the mess before everything unraveled. She claimed that she'd been blinded by the wedding and her insecurities. She said she understood that the wedding planning had made her act out of character, that she wasn't herself when she'd made those hurtful requests. But what struck me wasn't the apology itself. It was the way she spun everything. It was as though she was trying to make me feel responsible for her actions, making it sound like I had somehow contributed to her behavior. She said that if I had just been there for her, if I just understood the pressure she was under, maybe none of this would have happened. She hinted that my refusal to help her, my failure to forgive her quickly, had only pushed her further into her spiral. The message had the nerve to suggest that she was only human and made a mistake, as if the things she had done were just small missteps instead of calculated, hurtful actions. It was almost as though she was trying to make me feel sorry for her, as if she were the victim in this whole ordeal. She ended the message by asking me to reconsider everything, to let go of the past, to see her for who she really was underneath all the wedding chaos, and to at least have a one-on-one conversation with her. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was playing the victim. She was trying to turn the tables to make me the bad guy for not being more understanding, more forgiving. She had everything she wanted, her wedding, her fiancé, her life in the spotlight, and now she was trying to salvage what was left of her dignity and the illusion that everything was still okay. It was all so calculated, so predictable. I wasn't buying it. The more I read her message, the more I realized how little she had truly changed. She wasn't reaching out to genuinely make amends. No, she was reaching out because she could see that everything she had built was crumbling. The wedding, her image, her social standing, everything was falling apart, and she needed me to help fix it. She wanted me to patch up the relationship so that she could go on with her life and her wedding plans without the ugly stain of our broken friendship hanging over her. I could almost hear her voice as I read the message, sweet, pleading like a child who knew they had messed up but was too proud to admit it outright. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry for the consequences of her actions. And she wasn't reaching out to make things right with me. She was reaching out because she needed me to give her another shot, to let her back into my life. For a moment, I felt a flicker of anger. She had the audacity to reach out to me like this, after everything that had happened, after everything she had said, the way she had used me for her own gain, the way she had treated me like an afterthought while she chased her perfect wedding. She didn't get to waltz back into my life because she felt like it. I didn't need to be part of her drama, her perfect little world. I was done being the backup plan. Update 4. The next day, after my conversation with her, a call came through, my brother. It had been a while since we talked, and unlike everything else happening with the wedding, hearing from him felt like a breath of fresh air. I didn't know what I expected from this call, maybe just a quick check-in or a bit of small talk. I picked up immediately. His voice greeted me easily, the usual warmth in his tone, and he asked how I was doing. I had to stop for a second. He sounded relaxed, more at ease than I had expected, considering all that had gone down in the past few weeks. I'm fine, I said, trying to brush off the heaviness I'd been carrying lately. Just trying to deal with the fallout from all the chaos, nothing new. It wasn't like I was trying to avoid talking about it, but there was no need to dive into the wedding mess. We both knew what had been happening, and I didn't want to rehash every detail again. The tension from their breakup was thick enough, and the aftermath was all over the place, but it wasn't something that either of us had to get into. Then, just as I thought the conversation might slip into familiar territory, he asked if I'd be willing to help him with a few things. He needed me to come with him to handle some refunds, venues, catering, deposits. The situation was just hanging there, unresolved. I could tell by his voice that this wasn't something he wanted to do, but it was something that had to be done. I didn't mind helping. It sounded like something I could do without getting too involved in the drama. He wasn't asking me to fix things or step in as a mediator. He just needed someone to go with him to get things sorted and tied up. I agreed right away, glad I could offer some support without making things more complicated. But then he dropped something that caught me off guard. He told me that all the payments for the wedding had been made by him, every single one of them. All the deposits for the venue, the catering, the photographer, all of it. My stomach sank at the realization. None of it had been paid by his ex-fiancée or her family, not a cent. It was all on him. He had carried the financial weight of everything, which meant that when the wedding fell apart, the financial mess was left on his shoulders too. I sat there for a moment just processing what he had said, and it made my stomach churn. All those deposits, all that money, none of it had come from the bride or her family. My brother had been the one to make sure everything was taken care of while they went along with their plans, ignoring their responsibilities. I could feel my anger rising, and I didn't hold back. I asked him how he had gotten stuck with all of it. How had they let him take on everything without even offering to help? I was furious for him, for all the ways they had manipulated the situation to their advantage. They hadn't just pushed the wedding onto his shoulders, they had drained him dry. It wasn't just about the money, it was about how much they had expected him to carry while they sat back, leaving him to clean up the mess they created. After a moment, he sighed. He wasn't looking for pity, and neither was I. He told me he wasn't interested in talking to his ex-fiancée anymore. He tried a couple of times before the breakup, but each conversation had ended the same way, with no resolution, no clarity, just more empty promises and frustration. He said it wasn't worth it anymore. Not after everything that had happened. He wasn't in the right headspace to make amends or try to fix things. He was done. I could feel the resolve in his voice. It wasn't angry, but it was firm, like a door that had been closed shut after too many failed attempts to keep it open. He wasn't going to chase something that was already broken. I could feel my heart lighten at his words. I had seen him fight for her, for them, for so long, trying to make it work, trying to salvage something that wasn't meant to be. And now he was finally letting go. He was done putting in the effort, done trying to fix a relationship that had been doomed from the start. I told him I understood completely. He didn't owe her anything, especially not after everything she had done. I wasn't surprised by his decision, but hearing it out loud made it all feel real. He was stepping away from the situation, no longer tied to the past and no longer trying to force something to work that had been falling apart for months. As we wrapped up the conversation, I asked, "Does this mean you're truly done with her? Because I know her family is still hoping for some kind of reconciliation. They're probably expecting you to come around." There was a pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, it was with the same finality as before. "Yeah, I'm done. I'm not going back to that. I've got no interest in making it work. It's over." Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.